December 6th, 1969, and the Rolling Stones had just taken the stage at the Altamont Speedway in front of 300,000 people. They needed security for the stage, but instead of professionals, they hired a motorcycle club and paid them $500 worth of beer. As the Stones played, an 18-year-old named Meredith Hunter drew a revolver near the stage. One of the men guarding it stabbed him to death feet from where Mick Jagger was singing, and it was caught on film. Those men were the Hells Angels. And a killing at the biggest concert in the world would turn out to be one of the milder things they became known for. Because over the next 30 years, that same club would fire anti-tank rockets into buildings, murder prison guards, and set off a car bomb that killed an 11-year-old boy. But to understand how a motorcycle club became all of that, you have to go back to where it started. Not with a war, but with a single weekend in a small farming town in 1947. It was July of 1947 when Hollister, California, hosted a motorcycle rally. Thousands of riders descended on a town of a few thousand people. Among the clubs that came were the Booze Fighters, the Market Street Commandos, and one with a name nobody forgets, the Pissed Off Bastards of Bloomington. The weekend turned wild. Riders raced down the main street, threw bottles, and fought in the open. The local police were overwhelmed and called in state reinforcements. It was a drunken weekend that got out of hand, nothing more. But then a magazine ran a photograph of a heavy-set man slumped on a motorcycle, a beer bottle in each hand and dozens more scattered on the ground beneath him. The image went across the country. Overnight, the outlaw biker became a symbol of everything post-war America was afraid of. 6 years later, Marlon Brando would play that fear on screen in The Wild One. Hollister did something else too. In the months after the rally, tensions inside the Pissed Off Bastards boiled over, and a member named Otto Friedli walked away to start his own club. He built it in Fontana, near San Bernardino, in 1948. He called it the Hells Angels. Friedli is where the myth starts. He is named in most histories as the founder, but Friedli himself denied it, saying he had only been invited to a meeting by the new boyfriend of an ex-girlfriend. The popular story also calls him a World War II veteran, except the records say he was born in 1931, which would have made him 14 when the war ended. Some accounts push the real founding as late as 1951 and hand it to other men entirely. Nothing here resolves cleanly. The most famous motorcycle club on earth cannot say for certain who started it. What is certain is the kind of man it was built for. The war had just ended, and it had left two things behind in California: cheap military surplus motorcycles and thousands of young men who had come home and could not sit still. They had lived through danger and structure and brotherhood, and peacetime felt like nothing at all. A regular job could not touch what they were missing. The motorcycle club gave it back to them: the speed, the risk, and a group of men who would stand beside each other in a fight. Then there is the name, which the club guards more carefully than almost anything. For years, the story went that the Hells Angels were named after a unit of drunken, broken-down bomber crews who could not handle peace. A story that fit the outlaw image so well, the club almost let it stand. Almost. The truth runs through real military units that carried the name with honor, including a B-17 in the 303rd Bombardment Group that became the first in the 8th Air Force to fly 25 missions over Europe. But the man who actually handed the founders the name was Arvid Olsen, who had flown with the Hells Angels squadron of the Flying Tigers in China before America entered the war. He gave them the name and the red and white colors, and he never joined. Behind all of it sat the original spark, a 1930 Howard Hughes film about First World War pilots, titled Hells Angels. The Death's Head came later. In 1954, the original Fontana chapter merged with San Francisco's Market Street Commandos to form a second chapter, and its president drew the winged skull that still rides on every member's back today. For now, though, the Hells Angels were not what they would become. They were a loose, hard-drinking, hard-riding club of restless ex-soldiers and the younger men who wanted to be them. scattered across a handful of California chapters with no central command and no ambition past the next ride. They had a reputation, but it was a reputation for broken bottles and bar fights, not for organized crime. Turning this into something the whole world would fear took two things the club did not yet have: a leader who could turn a pack of brawlers into an organization, and a reason to start chasing money instead of the next party. Within 10 years, it would find both. The man who turned the Hells Angels into an organization did not found them. He was not even there at the start. His name was Ralph Barger, though almost no one ever called him that. To the world, he was Sonny. Barger was born in Modesto, California in 1938 and raised in Oakland, and the toughness that defined him was there from the beginning. He was thrown out of school for beating up teachers and other kids. At 16, he forged his birth certificate to enlist in the Army, served 14 months, and was honorably discharged the moment the military discovered he had lied about his age. He came home to Oakland looking for the same thing every other young man in his position was looking for: something to belong to. He found it on April 1st, 1957, when he and a group of riders founded a Hells Angels chapter in Oakland. One of them owned a patch from a defunct club, a small skull inside a set of wings, and they had copies made at a trophy shop in Hayward and wore them on their backs. Barger did not know at the time that there were already several other clubs scattered across California calling themselves Hells Angels. When he found out, he did not back down. He rode south, met the other chapters, and instead of fighting over the name, he organized them. Territory was divided. Bylaws were written. A loose scattering of clubs that happened to share a name became a single structured organization, and the Oakland chapter, with Barger at its head, sat at the center of it. They called it being first among equals. In practice, Barger was the closest thing the Hells Angels had to a leader. And in 1966, he made it official by incorporating the club. This was the turn that mattered. The Hells Angels stopped being a feeling and became an institution, with rank, rules, dues, and a chain of command modeled on the military lives many of its members had left behind. Law enforcement and the press would spend decades insisting Barger was the international president of a criminal empire. He spent decades denying it. The truth sat somewhere in between. No single man ran the Hells Angels, but no single man shaped them more than Sonny Barger. For most of America, none of this was visible yet. That changed over one weekend in 1964. On Labor Day weekend that September, a group of Hells Angels gathered at Monterey on the California coast, and two teenage girls reported that they had been dragged away from the crowd and raped by a number of members. 4 Angels were arrested. The charges were eventually dropped on insufficient evidence, and the club has always disputed the account. But the damage was already done, because the accusation had reached the desk of the California Attorney General, Thomas Lynch. Lynch put investigators on the club for 6 months, and on March 15, 1965, he released a report. It counted 466 Hells Angels across the state and laid out a long ledger of arrests and convictions, painting the club as an organized menace running on assault, intimidation, and sexual violence. Critics pointed out correctly that the report padded its numbers with offenses members had committed before they ever joined. It did not matter. The national media seized on the Lynch report and ran with it, and overnight the Hells Angels went from a regional nuisance to a household name. The club that had spent 17 years as a California curiosity was now famous across America, and the fame would only feed the legend. But the most important development of the decade had nothing to do with reputation. It had to do with money. For its first years, the club had no real income to speak of. Its members drank, fought, and rode, and paid for it however they could. What changed everything, according to the accounts of the era, was a legal bill. When members of the club faced serious charges and needed money to fund their legal defense, the Hells Angels turned to a product that was cheap to make, easy to move, and enormously profitable: methamphetamine. What began as a way to cover lawyers became a business. And then the business. The same disciplined territorial structure Barger had built to organize a motorcycle club turned out to be almost perfectly suited to running a drug network. Chapters became distribution nodes. Territory became market share. The brotherhood that protected a man in a bar fight now protected a supply chain. That is the moment the Hells Angels crossed a line they would never step back over. They had always been outlaws in the cultural sense, men who lived outside respectable society and enjoyed the fear it brought them. Now they were outlaws in the literal sense, an organization that made its money from crime and would defend that money the way any criminal enterprise defends it. The barroom brawlers of the 1950s were becoming something colder and more dangerous. That is the moment the Hells Angels crossed a line they would never step back over. They had always been outlaws in the cultural sense, men who lived outside respectable society and enjoyed the fear it bought them. Now they were outlaws in the literal sense, an organization that made its money from crime and would defend that money the way any criminal enterprise defends it. The barroom brawlers of the 1950s were becoming something colder and more dangerous. And at the exact moment they were turning into that, the wider culture decided it was fascinated by them. By the middle of the 1960s, the Hells Angels had become something almost nobody could have predicted. They were fashionable. The same counterculture that preached peace and love looked at these violent, hard-drinking outlaws and saw kindred spirits. Two groups standing against the same establishment, the same police, the same straight America. The hippies assumed the angels were on their side. It was a costly assumption. The man who got closest to the truth was a journalist named Hunter S. Thompson. In 1965, Thompson set out to write about the Hells Angels from the inside, and he spent roughly a year riding with the California chapters, drinking with them, and earning enough trust to see the club as it actually was, rather than as the newspapers imagined it. The book that came out of it made his career. But the relationship ended the way an outsider's relationship with the Angels usually ended. Thompson watched a member beating his wife and his dog, said so out loud, and was beaten savagely for it. He kept a shotgun on his wall for the rest of his life. What Thompson captured, and what the hippies refused to see, was that the Hells Angels were not gentle rebels. They were dangerous men who enjoyed being dangerous. For a while, that distinction stayed blurred, because the two worlds kept partying together. The novelist Ken Kesey threw the Angels into the middle of his LSD-soaked scene, and for a stretch, the bikers became regulars among the Grateful Dead and the acid crowd. An uneasy alliance that everyone pretended was something deeper than it was. Then came December 6, 1969, and the pretending stopped. The Rolling Stones wanted to end their American tour with a free concert, a West Coast Woodstock, and they threw it together at the Altamont Speedway with almost no planning. 300,000 people showed up. The Grateful Dead, who had used the Angels for security before, suggested them for this. The Stones agreed. The Hells Angels were hired to guard the stage, and they were paid in beer, $500 worth. It was a catastrophe from the start. The crowd was enormous, drugged, and pressed up against a stage that sat only a few feet off the ground. The Angels, drinking through the day, began swinging pool cues and chains to push people back, and the violence built hour by hour. One of them knocked the singer of Jefferson Airplane unconscious on stage. By the time the Rolling Stones came out to play, the day had already curdled into something menacing. During the set, as the band played Under My Thumb, an 18-year-old named Meredith Hunter pushed toward the stage. Hunter was young and black, in a sea of mostly white faces, and the situation around him turned. He was shoved back, came forward again, and at some point drew a revolver. A Hells Angel named Alan Passaro lunged off the stage and stabbed him. Hunter died about 20 feet from where Mick Jagger was singing. The Stones, not realizing a man had been killed, finished their set. The whole thing was caught on film. The Malos brothers were shooting a documentary of the tour, later released as Gimme Shelter, and the movie opens with Jagger watching the footage of the killing in an editing room months afterward, his face frozen. Passaro was tried and acquitted. the jury accepting that he acted in self-defense because Hunter had drawn a gun. Decades later, in 2005, investigators formally closed the case, confirming Pissarro had acted alone. But the verdict was almost beside the point, because Altamont killed something larger than one man. It killed the illusion. The counterculture had told itself that the Hells Angels were fellow travelers, rough around the edges but ultimately on the side of the dream. Altamont showed them on film beating concertgoers and stabbing a teenager to death at the foot of the stage. The friendship between the Hippies and the Angels died that night, and a generation watched it happen. For the Hells Angels, the timing could not have been sharper. They were already turning from a club into a criminal organization, already moving methamphetamine and building the structure that would carry them into the drug trade for decades. Altamont stripped away whatever romantic glow the counterculture had given them and left the harder truth exposed. They were not rebels with a cause. They were a business that ran on fear. And that business was about to leave California behind and go global, planting its flag on 4 continents and discovering, in one country in particular, just how profitable and how bloody the patch could become. For its first 13 years, the Hells Angels were a California story. That ended in 1961, when a chapter formed in Auckland, New Zealand, the first ever chartered outside the state. It was a small thing at the time, a single club on the far side of the Pacific, but it set a pattern that would repeat for the next 50 years. The patch traveled. London followed in 1969, then continental Europe, then South America, with a charter in Rio de Janeiro by 1984. Wherever there were restless young men and motorcycles and a criminal economy to tap, the Death's Head found a home. This was not random growth. The Hells Angels expanded the way a corporation expands by absorbing existing clubs and converting them. A local club would be scouted, tested, and eventually patched over, trading its own colors for the most feared brand in the motorcycle world. Overnight, a regional gang became part of an international organization with a reputation that did the intimidating for them. As one investigator put it, "You cannot underestimate the power of the patch." People saw the colors and they knew what the colors meant. As the club grew, so did the attention. By the late 1970s, American federal law enforcement had decided the Hells Angels were no longer a collection of rowdy bikers, but a full-time criminal enterprise, and they reached for the most powerful tool they had. In June of 1979, federal officers indicted Sonny Barger and a group of Hells Angels under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the same RICO law built to dismantle the mafia. The government's theory was that the club itself was a criminal organization and that its leaders could be held responsible for the crimes committed under its banner. It did not work. The trial ran 8 months, and in 1980 it collapsed into a mistrial when the jury could not agree on the racketeering charges. A second attempt failed the same way. The government had proven individual crimes, but it could not convince a jury that the club as an entity was a criminal conspiracy, in part because the Hells Angels structure was decentralized enough that guilt did not flow cleanly to the top. Barger walked on the racketeering charges. It was a humiliation for federal prosecutors and a vindication the club wore proudly. The Hells Angels had beaten the law's best weapon. But the same decentralization that protected the club in an American courtroom had a darker side overseas, because it meant chapters could pursue their own wars. And in Europe, one of those wars turned into something the continent had never seen. The Hells Angels had moved into Scandinavia in 1980, planting their first chapter in Denmark and quickly establishing themselves as the dominant force in the Northern European biker world. Smaller clubs that did not want to be absorbed banded together for protection, and in 1993, they began turning to the Hells Angels' great international rival, the Bandidos, patching over to gain a partner strong enough to stand against the Death's Head. Two superpowers of the outlaw world now faced each other across Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland. In January of 1994, they went to war. The Great Nordic Biker War lasted until 1997, and it did not look like a gang feud. It looked like a military conflict. Over more than 100 attacks, the two sides used automatic weapons, car bombs, hand grenades, and, most shocking of all, anti-tank rockets stolen from military depots. In April of 1996, a chapter clubhouse in Denmark was struck by an anti-tank missile while 14 men were inside. They survived. Hours later, a second missile hit an Allied clubhouse. Rockets were fired into buildings in the middle of populated cities. Bystanders were wounded in the blasts. By the time it ended, around 12 people were dead, and more than 90 were injured, and the violence had so alarmed Scandinavian governments that they passed sweeping new laws targeting the clubs directly. The war finally stopped in September of 1997, not because one side won, but because both sides realized they could not afford to continue. A Danish defense lawyer brokered a peace accord, the territories were divided, and the rockets went silent. But the Nordic War had revealed something permanent about what the Hells Angels had become. This was no longer a club that fought with fists and chains in California bars. It was a global organization willing to use weapons of war to protect its territory, and the patch that had spread across 4 continents carried that willingness everywhere it went. And yet the bloodiest chapter in the club's entire history did not happen in Scandinavia or California or anywhere the Hells Angels had been the longest. It happened in Canada, because when the Death's Head crossed that border, it walked into a war that would kill more than 160 people and drag an entire province into the crossfire. By the late 1970s, the Hells Angels were looking north. Canada was a rich, untapped market with major ports, established criminal networks, and a province that was already drowning in biker violence. Quebec in particular had become one of the most dangerous places for outlaw bikers in the world. At one point, more than 350 motorcycle gangs were fighting over the same streets and drug corners, and the violence was bad enough that the criminal underworld had a name for the province. They called it the Red Zone. The Hells Angels did not want to fight their way into that market one gang at a time. They wanted to absorb the strongest club already there and inherit everything it had built. The club they chose was the Popeyes, a Montreal gang deep in drug dealing and contract killing for the mafia, and hungry to join the big leagues. On December 5, 1977, the Popeyes stripped off their own colors and patched over to become the first Hells Angels chapter in Canada. In a single day, the Deaths had acquired a ready-made criminal network, a roster of experienced killers, and a foothold in the most violent biker market on the continent. But the Popeyes brought a problem with them, and that problem would nearly destroy the club from the inside. The men who had come up through the Popeyes were wild. They drank and used heavily. They were undisciplined, and they treated the patch as a license to do whatever they wanted. As the club grew, it split the Montreal operation into 2 chapters, and the divide ran straight along that fault line. The North chapter, based in Laval, and made up largely of former Popeyes, kept the reckless old attitude. The South chapter, based in Sorel, became disciplined, businesslike, and focused on money. One chapter was a liability, the other was an organization, and the organization decided the liability had to go. The North chapter's problems were not abstract. Its members were burning through the club's drug profits, snorting the product instead of selling it, drawing police attention, and behaving in ways that threatened everyone's income. The most dangerous of them was a man named Yves Trudeau, the chapter's most prolific killer, who would later be revealed as one of the deadliest hitmen in Canadian history. The South chapter's leadership looked at the North and saw a threat to the entire enterprise, so they planned a purge. On March 24, 1985, 5 members of the North chapter were invited to a meeting at the Hells Angels clubhouse in Lennoxville. Among them was Laurent Viau, known as L'Anglais, a founding figure and the chapter president. They arrived expecting club business. Dozens of Hells Angels were waiting for them inside. The 5 men were ambushed and shot dead. Their own brothers stripped the colors from their bodies, wrapped them in sleeping bags, weighted them down with cinder blocks and weightlifting plates, and dumped them into the St. Lawrence River near Sorel. A 6th man, a prospect, was killed in the weeks that followed. The club had executed its own members to clean house. For a while, it almost worked perfectly. The bodies sat at the bottom of the river, and the disappearances were treated as a missing persons matter. Police approached the girlfriends of the vanished men, asking when they had last seen them, getting nothing. Then, in June, a fisherman on the St. Lawrence snagged part of a decomposing body, and provincial divers went down and found the rest, still wrapped and weighted where the club had left them. The Lennoxville purge became public, and it horrified even people inside the criminal world. As one organized crime reporter put it, this was the moment the Hells Angels were doing a real cleanup to become a real criminal organization. They had decided that discipline mattered more than brotherhood, and they had proven it by murdering 5 of their own. The purge made the Quebec Hells Angels the most feared and disciplined biker organization in Canada. But it also planted a seed that would grow into something far worse. Because among the men watching the Hells Angels murder their own brothers was someone who took it as a profound betrayal of the outlaw code. A man named Salvatore Cazzetta. What he did in response would, within a decade, drag the entire province into a war that killed more than 160 people, bombed the streets of Montreal, and finally took the life of an 11-year-old boy. The man who watched the Lennoxville purge and refused to accept it was Salvatore Cazzetta. He and another rising figure in the Quebec underworld had come up together in the same white supremacist motorcycle club, 2 friends who shared the same world. But where Cazzetta was so disgusted by the Hells Angels murdering their own that he would not join them, his friend went the other way. His friend joined the Angels and rose. His name was Maurice Boucher, and almost everyone called him Mom. Boucher had been born in 1953 and raised in deep poverty in the Hochelaga-Maisonneuve district of East Montreal. He dropped out of school in the 9th grade, drifted into crime to feed a drug habit, and built a reputation as someone with the discipline and ruthlessness the Hells Angels prized. He joined the club in 1987, and by the mid-1990s, he had become the most powerful biker in Quebec. In 1995, he created an elite new chapter, the Nomads, made up of the most powerful Hells Angels in the province and bound to no single territory. Boucher's ambition was simple and total. He wanted to control every drug sold on every street in Quebec. Standing in his way was a rival gang called the Rock Machine, the club Cazzetta had helped build. The Hells Angels moved to force the Rock Machine's dealers and bars to surrender their drug trade. The Rock Machine refused, and in the summer of 1994, the 2 sides went to war. It would last 8 years, and it would not stay contained to the men who chose to fight it. For the first year, the war was a private bloodletting between bikers. Shootings, bombings, bodies. The public read about it and looked away, because the people dying were criminals killing other criminals. Then, on August 9, 1995, that changed forever. On a residential street in Boucher's own childhood neighborhood of Hochelaga-Maisonneuve, a Jeep was wired with a remote-controlled bomb. The target was a drug dealer connected to the rival side. When the bomb went off, it killed the man in the vehicle, but it also sent metal shrapnel tearing across the street, where an 11-year-old boy named Daniel Desrochers was playing near his home. A piece of it struck him in the head. He died in hospital days later. The death of Daniel Desrochers detonated something the bikers had never accounted for. For a year, the war had been background noise. Now, a child was dead, killed by a bomb on a Montreal street, and the entire province erupted in fury. The public demanded action. A special police squad was formed to go after the bikers directly. What had been a private war between criminals had become a public emergency, and the Hells Angels had made it personal for an entire society. Daniel Desrochers was the war's first innocent victim. He would not be the last. By the end, the conflict would kill around 160 people, including roughly a dozen bystanders who simply happened to be near the violence. But Boucher did not pull back under the pressure. He did the opposite. As police closed in on his Nomads chapter, he decided the way to win was to make the justice system itself afraid to touch him, and he reached for a target so far across the line that it shocked even hardened observers. He ordered the murder of prison guards. On June 26, 1997, a correctional officer named Diane Lavigne was shot and killed on her way home from work, targeted for no reason other than the uniform she wore. That September, a second guard, Pierre Rondeau, was murdered, and a third, Robert Corriveau, was targeted and survived. The logic was as cold as anything the club ever did. If ordinary officers of the state could be killed for doing their jobs, then judges, prosecutors, and police might think twice about pursuing the Hells Angels. Boucher was not just fighting a rival gang anymore. He was trying to terrorize the Canadian justice system into submission. It nearly worked. In 1998, Boucher was tried for ordering the guard murders and acquitted, walking out of court as the most powerful and most feared criminal in the country. But the police did not stop. They kept investigating, and they found the one thing that could bring him down. A man named Stéphane Gagné, nicknamed Godas, a Hells Angels associate who had taken part in the killings himself, agreed to testify against his boss. With Gagné's testimony, Boucher was retried, and in May 2002 he was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. The conviction effectively ended the war. The Hells Angels had won their fight against the rock machine, but the cost had been catastrophic. 160 lives, an 11-year-old boy killed by a bomb, 2 prison guards murdered to intimidate a justice system, and the most powerful biker in Canada sent to a maximum security cell, where he would die of throat cancer in 2022 without ever tasting freedom again. Boucher went away, but the organization he had led did not collapse with him. In the strange arithmetic of the outlaw world, the Hells Angels had paid an enormous price and still come out on top, because the war that destroyed Boucher had also destroyed their rivals. And in the years that followed, the club would consolidate that victory into something close to total control. The Quebec War made one thing clear across the country. The Hells Angels were going to win, and the smart move was to be on their side when they did. On December 29, 2000, in the clearest demonstration of that logic, roughly 168 members of Ontario's biggest motorcycle clubs, the Satan's Choice, the Paradise Riders, the Lobos, the Loners, and the Last Chance, drove to the Hells Angels bunker outside Montreal and patched over en masse. In a single ceremony, the club absorbed nearly the entire Ontario biker landscape and became the dominant force in Canada's most populous province overnight. The opposition tried to consolidate the same way. Weeks earlier, the rock machine had patched over to the Bandidos, the great American rival of the Hells Angels, hoping that the strength of an international brand could do what the rock machine alone could not. It did not work. The Canadian Bandidos were small, scattered, and weak, and within a few years they would destroy themselves in a way that echoed the Hells Angels' own history with horrifying precision. On April 8, 2006, a farmer near the village of Shedden in southwestern Ontario found 4 vehicles abandoned in his field with 8 bodies stuffed inside. All 8 were Bandidos, including the man believed to be the club's Canadian president. They had not been killed by the Hells Angels. They had been killed by their own Winnipeg chapter in an internal purge driven by a power struggle inside the club. 6 men were convicted of first-degree murder. It was Lennoxville all over again, a motorcycle club murdering its own members to settle who would control it, except this time, the club did not survive the cleansing. Shortly after Shedden, the Bandidos pulled out of Canada entirely. The last real organized opposition to the Hells Angels was gone, and the club, in the words of one investigator, was on Easy Street with a monopoly across Canada. But total dominance brought total attention, and the law had not given up. In April 2009, police launched Operation Charq-C, the largest strike ever aimed at the club in Canada. They arrested around 156 Hells Angels and associates and laid an indictment that included 22 counts of first-degree murder tied to the Biker War. For a moment, it looked like the organization that had survived everything was finally being dismantled. And then it slipped the net again, the same way it had slipped RICO decades earlier. The case was simply too big. The mega trial dragged on for years, and in 2015 a judge stayed the charges against most of the accused, ruling that the proceedings had taken so long they violated the defendant's basic right to a timely trial. Men accused of murder walked free, not because they were found innocent, but because the system that pursued them collapsed under the weight of its own case. The Hells Angels had once again proven that the bigger and more decentralized they became, the harder they were to destroy. That is the pattern of the entire history. Every weapon the world has thrown at the Hells Angels, from RICO in America to anti-tank rockets in Scandinavia, to the largest organized crime prosecution in Canadian history, has wounded the club without killing it. Today, the Death's Head flies on roughly 460 charters across nearly 60 countries. It remains the largest and most powerful outlaw motorcycle club on Earth. And in one of the strangest turns of all, the same organization that fought wars with bombs and rockets now defends itself just as fiercely in civil court, suing corporations like Disney and the fashion house Alexander McQueen for using its name and its winged skull without permission. A club born from restless war veterans drinking in a California garage in 1948 is now a global brand with lawyers, trademarks, and a logo it protects as aggressively as any corporation protects its own. That is the final truth of the Hells Angels. They began as men chasing the feeling of belonging they had lost when the war ended. They became a criminal organization that turned that brotherhood into a business, and the business into an empire that no government has ever managed to bring down. From a staged photograph in Hollister to a car bomb in Montreal, to a courtroom defending a trademark, the patch has outlasted everything sent to destroy it. And the Death's Head is still riding. No government has ever brought them down, but for all their secrecy, the club has crossed paths with some of the most famous names in the world. Click the next video to find out which celebrities have real documented ties to outlaw motorcycle clubs, from the journalists who rode with them to the actors who actually wore the patch.